A Lenten Meditation on the Friday after the third Sunday of Lent. It is by the Passion of Christ that we have been freed from the punishment due to sin. Surely he hath borne our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Isaiah 53:4. By the Passion of Christ we are freed from the liability to be punished for sin, with the punishment that sin calls for, in two ways, directly and indirectly. We are freed directly inasmuch as the Passion of Christ made sufficient, and more than sufficient, satisfaction for the sins of the whole human race. Now once sufficient satisfaction has been made, the liability to the punishment mentioned is destroyed. We are freed indirectly inasmuch as the Passion of Christ causes the sin to be remitted, and it is from the sin that the liability to the punishment mentioned derives. Souls in hell, however, are not freed by the Passion of Christ, because the Passion of Christ shares in its effect with those to whom it is applied by faith, and by charity, and by the sacraments of faith. Therefore, the souls in hell, who are not linked up with the Passion of Christ in the way just mentioned, cannot receive its effects. Now, although we are freed from liability to the precise penalty that sin deserves, there is nevertheless enjoined on the repentant sinner a penalty or penance of satisfaction. For in order that the effect of the Passion of Christ be fully worked out in us, it is necessary for us to be made of like form with Christ. Now we are made of like form with Christ in baptism by the sacrament. As is said by St. Paul, quote, "We are buried together with him by baptism into death." Romans 6:4. Whence it is that no penalty of satisfaction is imposed on those who are baptized. Through the satisfaction made by Christ, they are wholly set free. But since Christ died once for our sins, 1 Peter 3:18, once only, man cannot a second time be made of like form with the death of Christ through the sacrament of baptism. Therefore, those who sin again after baptism must be made like to Christ in his suffering, through some kind of penalty or suffering that they endure in their own persons. If death, which is a penalty due to sin, continues to subsist, the reason is this: the satisfaction made by Christ produces its effect in us insofar as we are made of one body with him, and the way limbs are one body with the head. Now, it is necessary that the limbs be made to conform to the head. Wherefore, since Christ at first had, together with the grace in his soul, a liability to suffer in his body, and came to his glorious immortality through the Passion, so also should it be with us, who are his limbs. By the Passion we are indeed delivered from any punishment, as a thing fixed on us. But we are delivered in such a way that it is in the soul that we first receive the spirit of adoption of sons and daughters of God, by which we are put on the list for the inheritance of eternal glory, while we still retain a body that can suffer and die. It is only afterward, when we have been fashioned to the likeness of Christ in his sufferings and death, that we are brought into the glory of immortality. St. Paul teaches this when he says, quote, "If sons, heirs also, heirs indeed of God, and joint heirs with Christ, yet so if we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified with him." Romans 8:17. Thus, in summary, the Passion of Christ frees us from the punishment due to sin in two ways: directly, by making sufficient atonement for all sins, and indirectly, by remitting sin itself. However, those in hell are not freed, as they are not linked to Christ through faith. While baptism frees one from the penalty of sin, those who sin after baptism must undergo penance, making themselves more like Christ and sharing in his suffering. Death continues as a result of sin because, like Christ, we must undergo suffering before achieving immortality. Ultimately, through suffering with Christ, we are made heirs to eternal glory. Finally, I think that it is abundantly clear, both in the Old Testament and the New, that this is how God intended it to be. Joshua and Moses are both figures which God uses in his divine providence as symbols for the Christian baptism. They both lead the Israelites through bodies of water for two things by which baptism accomplishes. And they are both types of Christ, showing how baptism conforms us to Christ. The Exodus and Moses' crossing of the Red Sea prefigure baptism, and they show the spiritual liberation and cleansing of Christ's sacrifice. Moses, as a type of Christ, leads the people out of the physical bondage in Egypt, while Christ frees believers from spiritual bondage through baptism. Joshua, he leads the people of Israel through the Jordan River in a way that signifies how baptism promises us eternal reward in heaven. As Joshua led the Israelites from outside of Zion into Zion, which was called the land of milk and honey, like a land which was promised for the Israelites at that time, which would be fruitful for them and they would enjoy. In this way, it's like a symbol for heaven, and Joshua as a symbol for Christ vanquishes the enemies of God, that being the Philistines, or in our case, that would be Satan and all of his works. And Joshua also prepares the land for the Israelites, just as Christ did by opening the gates of heaven to us. So in this way, we see that the nature of baptism and how it remits the punishment of sin as well is foreshadowed in the Old Testament.